My name is Emma, and I'm 24 years old. 3 weeks ago, I thought I was living the perfect life. I had just gotten engaged to the man of my dreams, my wedding dress was hanging in my closet, and I was planning the future I'd always imagined. Then I found my sister's diary hidden behind my bedroom dresser, and everything I believed about my life, my family, and the people I trusted most came crashing down around me. What I discovered in those pages didn't just break my heart. It shattered my entire understanding of who I was and who I could trust. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The betrayal was so deep, so calculated, that it took me days to even process what I was reading. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you the story of how I uncovered the most devastating secret of my life, and how it ultimately led me to discover truths about myself I never knew existed. I grew up in a modest two-story house in Columbus, Ohio, with my parents Michael and Sarah Chen, and my younger sister Jessica. Our family looked normal from the outside. Dad worked as an accountant at a local firm, Mom taught third grade at the elementary school down the street, and Jessica and I were just 2 years apart, close enough in age that everyone expected us to be best friends. But the reality was far more complicated than our suburban facade suggested. From the time I could form memories, there was an undercurrent of competition between Jessica and me that our parents seemed to not only tolerate but actively encourage. It started small, as these things always do. When I was 5 and Jessica was 3, I remember bringing home a drawing from kindergarten that I was particularly proud of. I had spent extra time on it, carefully coloring inside the lines and adding details that I thought made it special. I ran into the kitchen where Mom was preparing dinner, practically vibrating with excitement to show her my artwork. She glanced at it briefly, smiled and said it was very nice before turning back to the stove. But when Jessica toddled in 10 minutes later with a scribbled mess of crayon marks on construction paper, Mom dropped everything she was doing. She picked Jessica up, spun her around, and spent the next 15 minutes gushing about how creative and talented her little artist was. She hung Jessica's scribbles on the refrigerator while mine ended up in a drawer somewhere. That became the pattern of our childhood. I would achieve something, work hard for recognition, and receive polite acknowledgement. Jessica would do something half as impressive, and our parents would treat it like she had just cured cancer. When I made honor roll in third grade, Dad patted my head and said he was proud. When Jessica managed to pass second grade without being held back, they took her out for ice cream to celebrate. I learned early that working harder didn't necessarily mean getting more attention, but I kept trying anyway. I threw myself into academics, sports, music lessons, anything that might finally make my parents see me the way they saw Jessica. I played violin, made varsity soccer by my sophomore year, maintained a 4.0 GPA, and volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends. Jessica, meanwhile, coasted through school with C averages, quit every activity after a few weeks, and spent most of her time watching television or hanging out with friends. Yet somehow, Jessica remained the golden child. When she brought home a C+ on a math test, Mom would celebrate her improvement. When I brought home an A-, the response was always the same. "We know you can do better, Emma. You're so smart, this should be easy for you." The praise I craved was always just out of reach, while Jessica received endless encouragement for minimal effort. The dynamic between Jessica and me was strange and complicated. We weren't openly hostile toward each other, but there was always an underlying tension. She knew she was the favorite, though she pretended not to notice. I knew I was fighting for scraps of attention, though I tried to convince myself it didn't matter. Sometimes, when it was just the two of us, we could almost be normal sisters. We'd watch movies together, share secrets about school, even laugh until our stomachs hurt over inside jokes that no one else would understand. But those moments of genuine connection were always overshadowed by the competition that our parents had created between us. Jessica would make casual comments about how easy things seemed to come to me, as if my achievements required no effort at all. I would bite my tongue when she complained about how much pressure she felt to live up to my example, when the reality was that no one expected anything from her at all. As we got older, the favoritism became more pronounced and more painful. When it came time for college applications, my parents sat me down for a serious conversation about scholarships and student loans. "We can't afford to pay for your education," they explained, "but we know you're smart enough to figure it out. You've always been so independent and capable." Meanwhile, they had already started a college fund for Jessica, despite her mediocre grades and complete lack of direction about what she wanted to study. I applied for every scholarship I could find, worked part-time throughout high school to save money, and eventually managed to piece together enough financial aid to attend Ohio State University. I chose to stay local partly for financial reasons, and partly because I wasn't ready to leave my family entirely, despite how frustrated I felt with the dynamics at home. Jessica, when her time came, didn't even bother applying for scholarships. She enrolled at the same university 2 years later with her tuition fully paid by our parents, who had somehow found the money they claimed not to have when I needed it. College was the first time in my life that I felt like I could breathe. Away from the constant comparison and competition at home, I discovered who I was when I wasn't desperately trying to earn approval. I made friends who valued me for my personality rather than my achievements. I dated casually, nothing serious, but enough to realize that there were people in the world who appreciated my company without needing me to constantly prove my worth. I majored in marketing with a minor in graphic design, subjects that combined my analytical mind with a creative streak I hadn't known I possessed. My professors noticed my work, recommended me for internships, and helped me build a portfolio that would serve me well after graduation. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely proud of myself without needing external validation to make it meaningful. Jessica, predictably, struggled with the independence that college required. She changed majors 3 times, failed several classes, and constantly called home crying about how overwhelmed and stressed she felt. Our parents drove up to campus almost every weekend to check on her, bringing care packages and emotional support. They attended her sorority events, helped her with assignments, and basically functioned as her personal crisis management team. Meanwhile, I saw them maybe once a semester when they happened to be visiting Jessica, and had time to grab a quick lunch with me. Don't get me wrong, I had learned to be independent, and I was grateful for the self-sufficiency I had developed. But watching them pour so much energy into Jessica, while treating my success as if it was just expected and unremarkable, still stung. The pattern continued after graduation. I landed a job at a growing marketing firm in downtown Columbus, found a nice apartment that I could afford on my own, and started building what felt like a real adult life. Jessica moved back home after college, unsure of what she wanted to do with her degree in communications. Our parents were perfectly happy to support her while she figured things out, something they made clear would not have been an option for me. It was at a company happy hour about 6 months after I started my job that I met David Rodriguez. He was working as a software developer for a tech startup that shared office space in our building, and we literally bumped into each other at the coffee cart in the lobby. He was tall with dark hair and warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. When he accidentally knocked my coffee out of my hands, he was so apologetic and flustered that I couldn't help but laugh. He insisted on buying me a replacement coffee, then another one the next day when we ran into each other again. By the 3rd day, it was obvious that we were both timing our coffee runs to coincide with each other. He finally worked up the courage to ask me to dinner, and I said yes without hesitation. There was something about David that put me at ease immediately. He was funny without trying too hard, intelligent without being pretentious, and genuinely interested in hearing what I had to say. Our first date turned into a 4-hour conversation over Italian food, where we discovered we had surprisingly similar backgrounds despite our different ethnicities. He had grown up as the responsible older child, with parents who expected him to set a good example for his younger brother. Like me, he was driven and ambitious, but also carried the weight of always having to be the mature one in his family. We started dating exclusively within a month, and I knew pretty quickly that David was different from anyone I had dated before. He didn't just appreciate my achievements, he celebrated them in a way that felt genuine and unforced. When I got a promotion at work, he took me out to dinner and made a toast to my success. When I mentioned casually that I had always wanted to learn to paint, he surprised me with art supplies and signed us up for a couple's painting class. David made me feel seen in a way that I had never experienced before. He noticed when I was stressed about work and would show up at my apartment with takeout from my favorite restaurant. He remembered small details about things I had told him weeks earlier. He supported my goals and dreams without making me feel like I had to choose between my ambitions and our relationship. For the first time in my life, I felt like someone's first choice. About a year into our relationship, I brought David home to meet my family. I was nervous about how they would receive him, partly because I had never brought a serious boyfriend home before, and partly because I worried they would find some way to make the visit about Jessica instead of about this important milestone in my life. David, of course, was charming and respectful. He brought flowers for my mother and a bottle of wine for my father. He asked thoughtful questions about their work and interests, complimented Mom's cooking, and even helped Dad with some computer issues he had been struggling with. I could see that my parents liked him, which should have made me happy, and it did at first. But then Jessica came home from whatever she had been doing that afternoon, and I watched something shift in the dynamic. Jessica was 22 at the time, had inherited our mother's petite frame and blonde hair, and had always been conventionally pretty in a way that drew attention wherever she went. She also had a habit of turning on the charm whenever there was a new man around, something I had noticed but never really thought much about until that moment. She bounced into the living room wearing a sundress that showed off her figure, her hair perfectly styled despite having supposedly just gotten back from errands. She greeted David with a bright smile and a hug that lasted just a beat too long. Throughout dinner, she dominated the conversation, telling animated stories about her college adventures and asking David personal questions about his work, his family, his interests. She laughed at everything he said, touched his arm when she was making a point, and generally acted like I wasn't even there. I told myself I was being paranoid and insecure. Jessica was naturally outgoing and friendly. She wasn't intentionally trying to flirt with my boyfriend. David was just being polite by engaging with her questions and responding to her attention. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the whole interaction. David seemed to notice my discomfort because he made an effort to redirect the conversation back to me and to include me in his responses to Jessica's questions. When she asked about his job, he mentioned how proud he was of the project I was working on at my company. When she complimented his sense of humor, he credited me with being the one who actually made him laugh on a daily basis. I appreciated his attempts to keep me centered in the conversation, but I could also see that Jessica was enjoying the attention, regardless of his intentions. After we left that night, I asked David what he thought of my family. He was diplomatic but honest. "Your parents seem nice," he said. "They clearly care about both of you girls. Your sister is..."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Energetic, he paused, choosing his words carefully. "She seems like she's used to being the center of attention." I could tell he had picked up on the dynamic, but he didn't push the subject when I didn't respond immediately. I brought David around my family a few more times over the following months, and the pattern continued. Jessica would light up whenever he was around, dressing more carefully than usual, wearing more makeup, laughing louder at his jokes. She would find excuses to text me when she knew we were together, asking innocent questions about what we were doing or where we were going. She started showing up at events she had previously shown no interest in, like my company picnic and my birthday dinner, always with the explanation that she just wanted to spend more time with her big sister. I started to feel like I was going crazy. When I mentioned to David that Jessica seemed to be around a lot more lately, he agreed but didn't seem particularly concerned about it. "She's your sister," he said. "It's nice that she wants to be involved in your life. Maybe she's finally growing up and realizing how important family is." His response was so reasonable and charitable that I felt petty for even bringing it up. The truth was, I had spent so many years feeling overlooked and undervalued by my family that I had developed a hypervigilance about being pushed aside. I knew that I sometimes saw competition where none existed, that I could be oversensitive about perceived slights or moments when I felt ignored. So when David dismissed my concerns about Jessica, I tried to dismiss them too. I told myself that I was being the jealous, insecure older sister that I had always tried not to be. Things continued normally for several more months. David and I celebrated our second anniversary with a weekend trip to Chicago, where we explored the city, ate amazing food, and talked about our future together. We had started having serious conversations about marriage, about what we wanted our life to look like in 5 years, about whether we wanted kids and where we might want to live. These weren't abstract discussions anymore. We were talking about concrete plans, timelines, the kind of details you only discuss when you're certain you've found your person. I felt more settled and secure in our relationship than I ever had before. David had never given me any reason to doubt his feelings for me or his commitment to our future. He was consistent, reliable, affectionate, and transparent about his emotions in a way that made me feel safe and cherished. Whatever weird energy I had picked up on between him and Jessica seemed to have been a product of my own insecurities rather than anything real. That confidence made what happened next all the more devastating. It was a Saturday morning in early October, and David and I had plans to go apple picking, followed by dinner at a new restaurant we had been wanting to try. He was supposed to pick me up at 10, but he called around 9:30 to say that something had come up at work and he needed to go into the office for a few hours. He sounded genuinely disappointed and frustrated, apologizing repeatedly and promising to make it up to me. I wasn't thrilled about the change in plans, but I understood that sometimes work emergencies happen. David's job involved maintaining systems that couldn't afford to go down, so when there was a problem, he really did need to fix it immediately. We rescheduled for later that afternoon, and I decided to use the unexpected free time to finally tackle a cleaning project I had been putting off for weeks. My bedroom had become cluttered with clothes, books, and random items that I had been meaning to organize. I decided to start by rearranging my furniture, something I had been considering for a while but hadn't gotten around to doing. My dresser was heavy and awkward, but I managed to inch it away from the wall to clean behind it and see if a different position might work better for the room's layout. That's when I found it. Wedged between the back of the dresser and the wall was a small notebook with a floral cover that I didn't recognize. It must have fallen behind the dresser at some point, though I couldn't imagine how since I had never seen it before. I pulled it out, expecting to find some old journal of mine from high school or college that I had forgotten about, but when I opened the cover, I immediately recognized Jessica's handwriting. It was definitely her journal, though I couldn't figure out how it had ended up in my room. The dates on the entries went back several months, which meant it was recent. My first instinct was to close it immediately and return it to her without reading it. I had never been the type of sister who snooped through personal belongings, and I respected Jessica's privacy even when our relationship was complicated. But something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the fact that it had been hidden in my room, or maybe it was some subconscious instinct that something wasn't right. I flipped to a random page, telling myself I would just glance at it to confirm it was hers, and then give it back without reading the actual content. The first thing I saw was David's name. My heart started beating faster as I read the entry more carefully. It was dated just 2 weeks earlier, and it described in detail a conversation Jessica had with David when I wasn't around. She wrote about how easy he was to talk to, how much they had in common, how she felt like he really understood her in a way that most people didn't. She described feeling guilty about how much she enjoyed his attention, but also feeling like there was a special connection between them that she couldn't ignore. I felt sick to my stomach, but I couldn't stop reading. I flipped to earlier entries and found more references to David, more descriptions of interactions I hadn't known about, more evidence of a relationship between them that I had been completely unaware of. The entries painted a picture of a friendship, or something more than friendship, that had been developing parallel to my relationship with David for months. Jessica wrote about texting with David when I was at work, about conversations they had about their families, their dreams, their frustrations with their respective situations. She described feeling like she could be herself around him in a way that she couldn't with other people. She wrote about looking forward to family gatherings because it meant she would get to see him, about finding excuses to be around when she knew he would be visiting. The entries were filled with guilt and self-recrimination, but also with excitement and anticipation that made my blood run cold. Jessica clearly knew that what she was feeling was wrong, that pursuing any kind of relationship with her sister's boyfriend crossed every possible line, but she also seemed unable to stop herself from seeking out his attention and enjoying the connection she felt they had. As I read further, the entries became more explicit about her feelings. She wrote about fantasizing about what it would be like to be with David, about wondering if he felt the same connection she did, about imagining a scenario where they could be together without hurting me. She described analyzing every interaction they had for signs that he might be interested in her too, reading meaning into casual comments and friendly gestures. The most recent entries were the most disturbing. Jessica wrote about a conversation she and David had when I was out of town for a work conference the previous month. According to her account, they had talked for hours about everything and nothing, and she was convinced that something had shifted between them. She described feeling like he was seeing her, really seeing her for the first time. She wrote about the way he looked at her, the way their conversation flowed naturally, the way the evening felt charged with possibility. She ended that entry by writing that she thought David might be starting to have feelings for her too, and that she didn't know how much longer she could pretend that nothing was happening between them. She wrote about feeling torn between her loyalty to me and her growing certainty that David and she were meant to be together. I sat on my bedroom floor, holding my sister's diary in my shaking hands, feeling like the ground had disappeared beneath me. Everything I thought I knew about my relationship, my family, my life, had just been turned upside down. The man I loved and trusted completely had been having some kind of emotional affair with my sister. The sister I had shared a room with for 18 years, who I had protected and defended despite our complicated relationship, had been systematically trying to steal my boyfriend. The worst part was that I couldn't even be sure what was real and what was Jessica's wishful thinking. Was David actually encouraging this connection, or was Jessica misinterpreting his kindness as something more? Were they really having private conversations and secret text exchanges, or was Jessica exaggerating innocent interactions to feed her fantasy? I felt like I was drowning in questions that I didn't know how to answer. I heard my phone buzzing and realized that David was probably calling to confirm our rescheduled plans. I stared at his name on my screen, feeling like I was looking at a stranger. How could I talk to him normally when I had just discovered that he might be having an emotional affair with my sister? How could I act like everything was fine when my entire understanding of our relationship had just been shattered? I let the call go to voicemail and sat in my bedroom, still clutching Jessica's diary, trying to figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to confront them both immediately, to demand answers and explanations. But another part of me was terrified of what I might learn if I pushed for the truth. As long as I didn't ask the questions, I could still pretend that there might be an innocent explanation for everything I had read, but I knew that pretending wasn't going to work for long. The trust that had been the foundation of my relationship with David was already broken, even if he didn't know it yet. The security I had felt in our future together was gone, replaced by doubt and suspicion that would poison every interaction we had going forward. And my relationship with Jessica, complicated as it had always been, was now tainted with a betrayal that I didn't know if I could ever forgive. I realized that I was going to have to make some very difficult decisions about what to do with the information I had discovered. But first I needed to understand the full scope of what had been happening behind my back. I needed to read the rest of Jessica's diary, even though I was afraid of what else I might find. Because if I was going to confront this situation, I needed to know everything. I spent the next 3 hours reading every single page of Jessica's diary, and with each entry, my world crumbled a little more. What I had initially hoped might be one-sided infatuation on Jessica's part turned out to be something much more complex and devastating. The entries revealed a pattern of behavior that went back almost to the very beginning of my relationship with David, a calculated campaign to insert herself between us that I had been completely blind to. The early entries were subtle, describing how Jessica had started paying more attention to my relationship after meeting David that first time. She wrote about how different he seemed from the guys she usually dated, how mature and stable he appeared compared to the college boys she had been involved with. She described feeling envious of what David and I had together, but initially seemed to frame it as wanting to find something similar for herself rather than wanting to take what I had. But as the months progressed, the tone of the entries shifted. Jessica began documenting small interactions with David that I had never known about. She wrote about staying up late when she knew he would be dropping me off, positioning herself in the living room so she could say goodnight and extend their conversation. She described timing her visits home to coincide with when she knew he would be around, always with plausible excuses about needing to pick up clothes or spend time with family. The entries revealed that Jessica had been systematically collecting information about David through me. She would ask casual questions about his interests, his work stress, his family dynamics, then use that information to create opportunities for connection. When I mentioned that David was worried about his younger brother's struggles in college, Jessica happened to bring up her own college difficulties the next time she saw him. When I told her about David's love for hiking, she suddenly developed an interest in outdoor activities and asked for his recommendations. What made it worse was reading about how Jessica rationalized her behavior to herself. She wrote extensively about how she and David were more compatible than David and I were. She convinced herself that David was too polite to admit that he was settling for me when he could have something better with her. She wrote about how I didn't appreciate David the way she would, how I took our relationship for granted, how David deserved someone who would prioritize him above career ambitions and personal goals. The entries painted me as the selfish, career-focused sister who didn't have time for romance, while positioning Jessica as the warm, nurturing woman who would give David the attention and devotion he deserved. She wrote about how she could see David becoming frustrated with my busy schedule, how she noticed him looking lonely when I had to work late or travel for business. She interpreted every normal relationship challenge as evidence that David and I were fundamentally incompatible. But the most painful entries were the ones that detailed actual conversations between Jessica and David. According to her diary, they had been texting regularly for months. It started innocently enough, with Jessica reaching out to ask about birthday gift ideas for me, or to coordinate family events.
But the conversations gradually became more personal and frequent. David apparently shared details about work stress that he hadn't mentioned to me, family conflicts that I didn't know about, even doubts about his career path that we had never discussed. Jessica wrote about how easy it was to talk to David, how he opened up to her in ways that surprised them both. She described long phone conversations that happened when I was traveling or working late, conversations that covered everything from childhood memories to future dreams. She wrote about feeling like David's confident and emotional support system, roles that I had assumed belonged to me as his girlfriend. The entries revealed that Jessica had become increasingly bold in her pursuit of David's attention. She had started reaching out to him directly when she was having problems, rather than going through me. When she had car trouble, she called David instead of our father. When she was stressed about job interviews, she sought David's advice rather than asking for family support. She had systematically positioned herself as someone who needed David's help and protection, playing into his natural instinct to be helpful and supportive. Reading about David's responses to Jessica's overtures was almost more painful than reading about her pursuit of him. According to Jessica's accounts, David was consistently kind and supportive, but also maintained appropriate boundaries. He helped when she asked for assistance, offered advice when she sought guidance, and listened when she needed to vent. But Jessica interpreted his basic decency and politeness as evidence of special feelings for her. The entries showed how Jessica had been building a fantasy relationship with David based on his natural kindness and her own wishful thinking. She read romantic intent into friendly gestures, interpreted his concern for her well-being as evidence of deeper feelings, and convinced herself that David was only staying with me out of loyalty and obligation rather than genuine love. The recent entries were the most disturbing because they revealed Jessica's growing determination to act on her feelings. She wrote about her belief that David was unhappy with me but too honorable to break up with someone who was so invested in the relationship. She convinced herself that she would be doing us both a favor by giving David an excuse to end things with me. She wrote about planning to confess her feelings to David and give him permission to leave me for her. The final entry, dated just 3 days before I found the diary, was the most shocking of all. Jessica wrote about a plan to tell David that she was in love with him during my upcoming business trip to Chicago. She had apparently convinced herself that the distance and my absence would create the perfect opportunity for David to realize what he was missing. She wrote about how she would comfort him when he admitted that our relationship wasn't working, how she would be there for him during the difficult conversation he would need to have with me when I returned. Jessica had even planned out what she would say to me after the fact. She wrote about how she would frame David's decision to leave me as inevitable, something that would have happened regardless of her involvement. She planned to position herself as the messenger rather than the cause, the supportive sister who would help me understand that David and I simply weren't meant to be together.
She wrote about how grateful I would eventually be that she had helped me avoid a marriage that wouldn't have lasted. The level of calculation and manipulation revealed in those pages was breathtaking. This wasn't a simple case of sibling rivalry or innocent attraction that had gotten out of hand. Jessica had been systematically working to undermine my relationship for months, using information I had shared with her in confidence to create false intimacy with David. She had been playing a long game, positioning herself as the better choice, while simultaneously sabotaging my connection with the man I loved. But the most devastating part was realizing how successful her campaign had been. Reading Jessica's descriptions of her conversations with David, I could see how she had gradually become his go-to person for emotional support. She had made herself indispensable to him in ways that I hadn't even realized were happening. While I had been focused on building our future together, Jessica had been quietly inserting herself into David's present in ways that created intimacy and dependency. I sat in my bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of my sister's betrayal, feeling completely numb. The David I thought I knew would never have encouraged Jessica's pursuit or participated in the kind of emotional affair that her diary described. But the conversations and interactions documented in those pages suggested a level of connection between them that went far beyond what I would consider appropriate for my boyfriend and my sister. I realized that I had been living in a completely different reality than the one that actually existed. While I had been planning our future and falling deeper in love with David, he had been developing a separate relationship with Jessica that I knew nothing about. While I had been proud of how well David got along with my family, Jessica had been using that access to create opportunities for seduction that I was too trusting to see. The worst part was understanding how perfectly Jessica had played both sides of the situation. To me, she had been the loving sister who was finally showing interest in my relationship and wanting to be more involved in my life. To David, she had been the understanding confidant who provided emotional support and validation that apparently I wasn't giving him. She had managed to position herself as indispensable to both of us, while secretly working to destroy what we had together. I looked at my phone and saw several missed calls from David, along with text messages asking if I was okay and whether we were still on for dinner. The thought of seeing him, of pretending that everything was normal when I now knew about his secret relationship with Jessica, made me feel physically sick. How could I sit across from him at dinner and make small talk when I knew he had been confiding in my sister about things he hadn't shared with me? How could I trust anything he said when I now knew he had been living a double life for months? But I also knew that I couldn't avoid him indefinitely. If I was going to salvage anything from this situation, I needed to understand David's perspective on what had been happening. I needed to know whether Jessica's diary entries were accurate representations of their interactions or delusional fantasies based on misinterpreted kindness. I needed to know whether David had feelings for Jessica, whether he was planning to leave me, whether our entire relationship had been a lie. I finally called David back, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained that I wasn't feeling well and needed to postpone our dinner plans. He was immediately concerned, offering to bring me soup or medicine, asking if I needed him to take me to urgent care. His genuine worry and care for my well-being made Jessica's portrayal of him as someone who was just going through the motions with me seem even more confusing and painful. After hanging up with David, I knew I needed to confront Jessica before I talked to him. I needed to understand her motivations, her intentions, and her version of what had been happening between them. I needed to know whether she had been planning to act on the feelings described in her diary, and I needed to make it clear that I knew exactly what she had been doing. Jessica was still living at home with our parents, so I drove over to the house where we had grown up, feeling like I was heading into battle. I found Jessica in her childhood bedroom, scrolling through her phone and looking completely relaxed and carefree. Seeing her lounging casually on her bed, oblivious to the fact that her secret had been discovered, filled me with a rage that I had never experienced before. I walked into her room without knocking and closed the door behind me. Jessica looked up from her phone with a smile that quickly faded when she saw the expression on my face and the floral notebook in my hand. The color drained from her face as she realized what I had found, and for a moment neither of us said anything. "I found this behind my dresser," I said, holding up the diary. "I read it, Jessica. I read every single page. I know about the texts, the phone calls, the conversations you've been having with David behind my back. I know about your plan to confess your feelings to him while I'm out of town next week. I know everything. Jessica's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. Emma, I can explain. It's not what you think. Those are just private thoughts, not actual plans. I would never actually try to steal David from you, but her words sounded hollow even to her own ears, and we both knew that her diary contained far more than just private thoughts. You've been systematically trying to insert yourself into my relationship for months, I continued, my voice getting louder despite my efforts to stay calm. You've been collecting information about David through me and using it to create fake intimacy with him. You've been positioning yourself as his emotional support system while pretending to be the loving sister who just wants to be close to her family. This isn't some innocent crush, Jessica, this is calculated manipulation. Jessica started crying, but I could see the calculation even in her tears. She was trying to figure out how to minimize the damage, how to reframe her behavior in a way that would make her seem like the victim rather than the perpetrator. I've been lonely, she said, through her sobs. You and David have this perfect relationship, and I've been struggling to find someone who understands me the way he understands you. I never meant for it to go this far. I never actually planned to act on my feelings. But I had read her diary. I knew that she had absolutely planned to act on her feelings, and that she had been building toward that moment for months. Her denials and attempts to minimize her behavior only made me angrier, because they showed that she still didn't understand the magnitude of what she had done or the pain she had caused. The conversation that followed was one of the most painful of my life. Jessica alternated between denying the seriousness of her actions, blaming me for not being attentive enough to David, and playing the victim who had been overcome by feelings she couldn't control. She tried to convince me that David had been encouraging her pursuit, that he had been complaining about our relationship, that he had been giving her signals that he was interested in her romantically. But when I pressed her for specific examples, her stories fell apart. The evidence she cited for David's supposed dissatisfaction with me were normal relationship challenges that every couple faces. The signs she interpreted as romantic interest were basic human kindness and politeness. The complaints she claimed David had made about me were her own interpretations of casual comments taken out of context. What became clear during our confrontation was that Jessica had built an entire fantasy relationship with David based on her own desires rather than any reality. She had convinced herself that David was unhappy with me because she wanted to believe it was true. She had interpreted his kindness as romantic interest because she needed to justify her own behavior. She had created a narrative where she was the hero saving David from an unsatisfying relationship rather than the villain trying to destroy her sister's happiness. But understanding Jessica's motivations didn't make her betrayal any less painful. She was my sister, the person who was supposed to support and protect me, not systematically work to undermine my happiness. She had used our family bond to gain access to my relationship, then exploited that access to try to steal the man I loved. She had smiled to my face while plotting behind my back, pretending to be happy for my success, while working to ensure my failure. The confrontation ended with Jessica begging me not to tell David about the diary, claiming that it would destroy any chance of our family staying intact. She promised that she would stop all contact with David, that she would move out of our parents' house, that she would do whatever it took to make things right between us. But her promises felt empty because they were motivated by fear of consequences rather than genuine remorse for what she had done. I left Jessica's room feeling more confused and hurt than when I had arrived. The sister I thought I knew, the person I had grown up with and shared a lifetime of memories with, had been revealed as someone capable of deliberate cruelty and manipulation. The family dynamic I had always found frustrating but manageable had been exposed as something much more toxic and damaging than I had ever realized. But even more challenging was the realization that I still didn't know the truth about David's role in what had been happening. Jessica's diary painted him as either a willing participant in an emotional affair or an innocent victim of her manipulation, and I couldn't tell which version was accurate. I needed to hear David's side of the story before I could decide what to do about our relationship and our future together. The drive home from my parents' house felt like the longest trip of my life. I knew that the conversation I was about to have with David would determine the direction of the rest of my life. Either I would discover that the man I loved had been betraying me with my sister, or I would learn that Jessica had been more delusional than manipulative. Either way, the trust and security that had been the foundation of our relationship was already damaged, and I didn't know if it could ever be fully repaired. I called David when I got back to my apartment and asked him to come over. I told him that we needed to talk about something important, and the concern in his voice when he agreed to come immediately made my heart ache. This was either the man who loved me enough to drop everything when I needed him, or the man who had been lying to me for months while carrying on an emotional affair with my sister.
As I waited for David to arrive, I realized that regardless of what I learned from our conversation, my life was about to change dramatically. The future I had been planning with David was now uncertain. The relationship with my sister was probably irreparably damaged. The family dynamic that had shaped my entire life was going to have to be completely restructured. I was about to lose either the man I loved or the last illusions I had about my family, and possibly both. When David knocked on my door 20 minutes later, I took a deep breath and prepared myself for what might be the most important conversation of my life. David walked into my apartment, carrying a bag from the pharmacy and wearing the concerned expression that I had grown to love over the past 2 years. He immediately came over to feel my forehead, checking for fever, and asked if I had eaten anything that day. His genuine care for my well-being made what I was about to do even more difficult, but I knew there was no avoiding this conversation. "I need to show you something," I said, leading him to sit on my couch. I held Jessica's diary in my hands, my fingers trembling slightly as I tried to find the right words to begin. "David, I found this today while I was cleaning my room. It's Jessica's diary, and it was hidden behind my dresser. I don't know how it got there, but I read it and there are things in here about you that I need to understand." David's expression shifted from concern to confusion as he looked at the floral notebook. He reached for it hesitantly, but I pulled it back slightly. "Before you read any of this, I need you to tell me about your relationship with Jessica. Have you been talking to her privately, texting with her, having conversations with her that I don't know about?" The look that crossed David's face told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. It was guilt mixed with surprise, the expression of someone who had been caught doing something they knew was inappropriate but hadn't expected to be discovered. He ran his hand through his hair, a nervous habit I recognized, and took a deep breath before responding. "Emma, yes, Jessica and I have talked occasionally. She's reached out to me a few times when she needed help or advice, and I didn't want to be rude by ignoring her. But it's not what you're probably thinking. I never encouraged anything inappropriate, and I certainly never had any romantic feelings for her. She's your sister, and I love you. I would never betray you like that." His words should have been reassuring, but the defensive tone in his voice and the fact that he had hidden these conversations from me made me feel even more uneasy. I opened the diary to one of the entries that detailed a long phone conversation between them and handed it to him. "Read this," I said. "Tell me if Jessica's version of your interactions matches your memory of what actually happened." David read the entry I had marked, his face growing paler with each line. When he finished, he looked up at me with an expression of shock and horror. "Emma, this is not what happened. Yes, we had a phone conversation that night when you were in Denver, but it wasn't anything like what she's describing here. She called me because she was upset about a job interview that went badly, and I tried to be supportive because she's your sister. But all this about special connections and charged moments, that's completely in her head." I took the diary back and flipped to another entry, one that described Jessica's interpretation of text exchanges between them. "What about this?" I asked, showing him Jessica's detailed analysis of their text conversations and her belief that David was developing feelings for her. "Have you been texting with her regularly?" David's face flushed with embarrassment as he read. "Yes, we've texted, but look at what she's reading into completely innocent messages. When I said I hoped her day got better after she told me about having car trouble, she interpreted that as me caring about her in some special way. When I sent her information about hiking trails after she asked for recommendations, she thought I was trying to create opportunities for us to spend time together. I was just being friendly and helpful, the way I would be with anyone in your family." I could see that David was genuinely disturbed by Jessica's interpretations of their interactions, but I was still struggling with the fact that he had been having a relationship with my sister that I knew nothing about.
Why didn't you tell me about these conversations? I asked. Why did you keep this secret from me? David was quiet for a long moment, clearly trying to figure out how to explain his reasoning. Honestly, he said finally, I didn't think it was important enough to mention. Jessica would text me occasionally with random questions or to vent about something, and I would respond because I didn't want to be rude. But the conversations were so brief and casual that it didn't occur to me that you would want to know about every single interaction I had with your family members. But this wasn't just casual interaction, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. According to her diary, you were having long phone conversations about personal topics. You were giving her advice about major life decisions. You were sharing details about your own life that you hadn't even shared with me. That's not the same as briefly responding to random questions. David looked genuinely confused and hurt by my accusations. What details did I supposedly share with her that I haven't shared with you? He asked. Emma, you know everything important about my life. You know about my work stress, my family issues, my concerns about the future. If Jessica thinks I was confiding special secrets in her, she's delusional. I opened the diary to an entry where Jessica described David talking about his worries regarding his younger brother's struggles with addiction, something David had never mentioned to me. According to Jessica, David had expressed feeling guilty about not being able to help his brother more, and had talked about how helpless he felt watching someone he loved make destructive choices. David read the entry with growing alarm. I did mention my brother's situation to Jessica, he admitted, but only because she was talking about her own struggles with direction and purpose, and I was trying to help her understand that everyone goes through difficult periods. I thought I had told you about Miguel's problems, but maybe I didn't because I know how much you worry about family issues, and I didn't want to add to your stress. The fact that David had been protecting me from worry while simultaneously sharing those same concerns with Jessica felt like another betrayal, even though I could understand his reasoning. But what bothered me more was the pattern that was emerging. David had been treating Jessica as a confidant and emotional support system in ways that created intimacy between them, even if he hadn't intended it romantically. We spent the next hour going through various entries in Jessica's diary, with David explaining his version of events and expressing shock at how Jessica had interpreted their interactions. It became clear that while David had never intended to encourage Jessica's romantic feelings or engage in an emotional affair, he had been naive about the impact of his kindness and attention on someone who was clearly infatuated with him. David's explanations were consistent and believable, and I could see that he was genuinely horrified by Jessica's interpretations of their relationship. But what was harder to accept was his failure to recognize the inappropriate nature of maintaining a private relationship with my sister, regardless of his intentions. He had allowed Jessica to become emotionally dependent on him, while keeping me in the dark about their connection. The conversation grew more heated as I tried to make David understand why his behavior, even if well-intentioned, had contributed to the situation we were now facing. He kept insisting that he had done nothing wrong, that Jessica's feelings were her responsibility, not his, and that he couldn't be blamed for someone else's misinterpretation of his kindness. But I felt like he was missing the point entirely. By maintaining a private relationship with Jessica, by responding to her emotional needs and giving her the attention and validation she was seeking, he had created the conditions that allowed her fantasy to flourish. Even if he hadn't intended to encourage her feelings, his behavior had absolutely enabled them. The fight that followed was unlike any disagreement David and I had ever had. I accused him of being emotionally unfaithful and creating inappropriate intimacy with my sister. He accused me of being jealous and paranoid, of blaming him for Jessica's psychological issues. We both said things that we immediately regretted, words that revealed underlying resentments and insecurities that neither of us had been willing to acknowledge before. Eventually, we both exhausted ourselves arguing and sat in silence on opposite ends of my couch, the diary between us like evidence in a trial where we were both prosecution and defense. I realized that regardless of who was more at fault for what had happened, our relationship had been fundamentally damaged by the secrets and betrayals that had been revealed. David finally broke the silence by asking what I wanted to do next. "Do you want to break up?" he asked quietly. "Do you think we can work through this, or has too much damage been done?" His willingness to consider ending our relationship, rather than fighting to save it, told me something important about where his heart really was. I don't know, I answered honestly. I love you and I believe that you never meant to hurt me or encourage Jessica's feelings. But I also feel like I don't know who you really are anymore. The David I thought I was in love with wouldn't have maintained a secret relationship with my sister, no matter how innocent his intentions were. The David I trusted wouldn't have hidden important parts of his life from me while sharing them with someone else. We agreed to take a break from each other while we both processed what had happened and figured out what we wanted for our future. David would stay at his own apartment, and we would avoid contact for at least a week while we both had time to think clearly about whether our relationship could recover from this betrayal of trust. After David left, I called my best friend Rachel and asked if I could come stay with her for a few days. I couldn't bear the thought of being alone in my apartment, surrounded by reminders of the life I had been planning with David and the sister I had trusted despite our complicated relationship. Rachel immediately agreed, and I packed a bag and drove to her place, feeling like a refugee from my own life. Over the next few days, Rachel helped me process everything that had happened. She listened to me read passages from Jessica's diary, comforted me when I cried about feeling betrayed by the two people I had trusted most, and helped me think through my options for moving forward. Having an outside perspective was invaluable because Rachel could see the situation clearly without the emotional investment that was clouding my judgment. Rachel pointed out that while David's behavior had been inappropriate and hurtful, Jessica's actions were deliberate and calculated in a way that was much more disturbing. David had made mistakes in judgment and failed to maintain appropriate boundaries, but Jessica had systematically worked to undermine my relationship while pretending to support it. The level of deception and manipulation revealed in her diary suggested psychological issues that went far beyond normal sibling rivalry. But Rachel also helped me understand that my willingness to excuse and minimize Jessica's behavior over the years had contributed to the current situation. I had been so focused on trying to earn my parents' approval and maintain family harmony that I had ignored red flags about Jessica's character and capacity for jealousy and manipulation. I had made excuses for her selfishness and entitlement rather than setting appropriate boundaries. During my time at Rachel's apartment, I also had to deal with the fallout from my confrontation with Jessica. She had apparently told our parents some version of what had happened, because I received several calls from my mother demanding to know why I was causing family drama over something so trivial. Mom's response was predictably dismissive of my feelings and protective of Jessica, which reminded me why I had been so reluctant to seek family support in the first place. I also received multiple texts and calls from Jessica herself, alternating between apologies and attempts to minimize what she had done. She claimed that she had exaggerated her feelings in her diary for dramatic effect, that she never would have actually acted on her attraction to David, and that I was overreacting to what was essentially harmless fantasy. But I had read enough of her detailed plans and rationalizations to know that her denials were lies designed to escape consequences rather than genuine remorse. After 5 days of staying with Rachel and thinking constantly about my situation, I realized that I needed to make some major decisions about my future. I couldn't continue living in limbo, wondering whether David and I could rebuild our relationship or whether my family dynamics could ever be healthy and supportive.
I needed to take control of my life and make choices based on what was best for my own well-being, rather than what would maintain the status quo or make other people comfortable. I decided to break up with David. Even though I believed his explanations about his intentions, I couldn't get past the fact that he had maintained a secret relationship with my sister and failed to recognize how inappropriate his behavior was. More importantly, I realized that the trust between us had been damaged in a way that would probably never fully heal. I would always wonder whether he was being completely honest with me, and he would always feel like he was being unfairly blamed for Jessica's psychological issues. The conversation where I ended our relationship was one of the saddest of my life. David cried and begged me to reconsider, promising that he would cut off all contact with Jessica and be completely transparent about all his relationships going forward. But I knew that trying to rebuild what we had would require more energy and faith than I possessed after everything that had happened. I also decided to cut off contact with Jessica indefinitely. The level of betrayal and manipulation revealed in her diary had shown me that she was not capable of being a healthy, supportive presence in my life. I couldn't trust her around future romantic relationships, and I couldn't pretend that we could maintain a normal sisterly bond after what she had tried to do.
My parents were furious about my decision to distance myself from Jessica, accusing me of being vindictive and dramatic. They demanded that I forgive and forget for the sake of family unity, but I refused to pretend that nothing had happened or that Jessica's behavior was acceptable. For the first time in my life, I prioritized my own emotional well-being over maintaining family harmony. The hardest part of my decision was accepting that the future I had planned was gone. David and I had talked about marriage, children, building a life together, and now all of those dreams had to be abandoned. I had to rebuild my vision of what my life could look like without the man I loved and without the family support I had always hoped to earn. But there was also something liberating about finally acknowledging the reality of my relationships rather than continuing to live in denial. I was done making excuses for people who hurt me, done prioritizing other people's comfort over my own well-being, done accepting crumbs of affection when I deserved genuine love and respect. 6 months later, I can say that ending my relationship with David and cutting contact with Jessica were the right decisions for me. I'm still healing from the betrayal and working to rebuild my sense of trust in people, but I'm no longer living in a fantasy where I pretend that toxic relationships can be fixed through enough effort and patience on my part. I've learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from people who consistently choose to hurt you, even when those people are family members or romantic partners you care deeply about. I've learned that my worth isn't determined by other people's ability to see and appreciate it, and I've learned that building a life based on honest relationships and healthy boundaries is more fulfilling than maintaining connections that require me to constantly compromise my own well-being. The diary that I found behind my dresser revealed truths that were painful to accept, but it also freed me from illusions that were preventing me from building the authentic, loving life that I deserve. Sometimes the most devastating discoveries can also be the most liberating, because they force you to stop accepting less than your worth and start demanding the respect and honesty that should be the foundation of any meaningful relationship. 2 years have passed since I found Jessica's diary, and I'm sitting in my new apartment in Portland, Oregon, watching the rain streak down my windows as I reflect on how dramatically my life has changed. The woman I am today feels like a completely different person from the one who used to desperately seek approval from family members who were incapable of giving it and romantic partners who couldn't be trusted with my heart. Moving across the country was the best decision I ever made for myself. After ending things with David and cutting contact with Jessica, I realized that staying in Columbus would mean constantly running into reminders of the life I had lost and the people who had betrayed me. I needed a fresh start somewhere that held no memories of the pain and disappointment that had defined my relationships for so long. Portland offered everything I was looking for. The marketing firm that hired me was innovative and collaborative, filled with people who valued creativity and authentic connection over office politics and superficial networking. My colleagues became genuine friends who supported my professional growth while also caring about my personal well-being. For the first time in my career, I felt valued not just for my productivity but for my unique perspective and contributions. The apartment I found is a converted loft in the Arts District, with exposed brick walls and huge windows that flood the space with natural light. I decorated it with artwork from local artists, plants that thrive in the Pacific Northwest climate, and furniture that reflects my own taste rather than trying to impress anyone else. Every corner of my home feels authentically mine in a way that my old apartment never did. I've built a social circle here that feels genuine and supportive. I joined a hiking group that explores the beautiful trails around Mount Hood and the Columbia River Gorge. I take pottery classes at a community center where I've learned to create beautiful imperfect bowls and vases with my own hands. I volunteer at a literacy program that helps adults improve their reading skills, work that gives me a sense of purpose beyond my professional achievements. The friendships I've developed in Portland are different from any relationships I had before. They're based on mutual respect and genuine enjoyment of each other's company rather than obligation or shared history. My friend Marcus, who works as a chef at a farm-to-table restaurant downtown, has taught me to appreciate food as an art form and introduced me to ingredients I had never heard of. Sarah, a photographer who lives in my building, has shown me how to see beauty in ordinary moments and helped me develop an eye for composition and light. These relationships feel easy and natural in a way that my family connections never did. There's no competition, no hidden agendas, no need to constantly prove my worth or earn my place in their lives. They accept me as I am while also encouraging me to grow and explore new aspects of myself. When I'm with them, I feel seen and appreciated for qualities I didn't even know I possessed. I've also learned to enjoy being alone in ways that I never thought possible. The solitude that used to feel lonely and inadequate now feels peaceful and restorative. I can spend entire weekends reading, cooking elaborate meals for myself, working on art projects, or simply sitting in my favorite coffee shop watching the world go by without feeling like I'm missing out on anything or disappointing anyone. The relationship I've developed with myself has been the most transformative aspect of this journey. I've learned to trust my own instincts about people and situations rather than constantly second-guessing myself or making excuses for other people's harmful behavior. I've discovered that I actually enjoy my own company and that my happiness doesn't depend on other people's approval or validation. Therapy has been an essential part of this healing process. Dr. Williams, the psychologist I've been seeing for the past year and a half, has helped me understand the patterns that kept me trapped in unhealthy relationships for so long. We've worked together to identify the childhood experiences that taught me to equate love with struggle and to believe that I had to earn affection through perfect behavior and constant achievement. Through our sessions, I've learned to recognize the difference between genuine love and manipulation, between healthy support and enabling behavior, between normal relationship challenges and fundamental incompatibility. I've developed skills for setting boundaries, communicating my needs clearly, and walking away from situations that compromise my well-being. One of the most important insights I've gained is understanding how my family's dysfunction affected my ability to form healthy relationships. Growing up in an environment where love was conditional and attention was scarce taught me to accept crumbs of affection as if they were feasts. I learned to be grateful for minimal consideration and to blame myself when relationships failed rather than recognizing when other people were incapable of giving me what I deserved. Dr. Williams has helped me see that Jessica's betrayal, while painful, was actually a gift in disguise. It forced me to confront the reality of my family dynamics and the ways I had been settling for less than I deserved in all areas of my life. The diary that revealed her calculated manipulation also revealed my own patterns of denial and self-sacrifice that were preventing me from building the authentic, fulfilling life I actually wanted. I've had minimal contact with my family since moving to Portland. My parents call occasionally, usually around holidays, but our conversations are superficial and brief. They've never acknowledged the harm that Jessica caused or taken responsibility for the favoritism that created the conditions for her betrayal. Instead, they continue to treat the situation as a temporary disagreement that should be forgotten for the sake of family unity. Jessica has attempted to reach out several times, sending long emails filled with apologies and explanations that always end with requests for forgiveness and reconciliation. Her messages reveal that she still doesn't understand the depth of what she did or take genuine responsibility for the calculation and manipulation involved in her pursuit of David. She frames her behavior as a mistake driven by loneliness and insecurity rather than a deliberate betrayal that caused real harm. I don't respond to these attempts at contact because I've learned that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. I can release my anger and resentment toward Jessica without allowing her back into my life where she could cause additional harm. Some relationships are too damaged to repair, and some people are too toxic to maintain connection with, regardless of shared DNA or family expectations. I've heard through mutual acquaintances that David is still single and apparently struggling with the consequences of his poor judgment. A former colleague mentioned seeing him at a local coffee shop and said he looked tired and unhappy. Part of me feels sad for him because I do believe his intentions were never malicious, but I also know that ending our relationship was the right decision for both of us. The trust that was broken between David and me could never have been fully repaired. Every interaction would have been colored by doubt and suspicion, every conversation potentially hiding secrets that could devastate me again. A relationship built on that foundation of mistrust and resentment would have eventually crumbled anyway, probably in an even more painful and destructive way. I've started dating again recently, but with a completely different approach than before. I'm no longer desperate to find someone to complete me or validate my worth. Instead, I'm looking for someone who complements the full, satisfying life I've already built for myself. I want a partner who enhances my happiness rather than someone I need to make me feel whole. The man I've been seeing for the past few months, Andrew, is a marine biologist who works for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. He's quiet and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor and a passion for ocean conservation that matches my own commitment to environmental sustainability. Our relationship is developing slowly and naturally, without the intense drama or hidden agendas that characterized my previous romantic experiences. What I appreciate most about Andrew is his transparency and consistency. He says what he means, follows through on his commitments, and treats me with the kind of respect and consideration that I now understand should be the baseline for any healthy relationship. There are no games, no secrets, no need to constantly wonder where I stand with him or whether he's being honest about his feelings. I've also learned to pay attention to how potential partners treat service workers, family members, and people who can't do anything for them. These interactions reveal character in ways that charm and romantic gestures never could. Andrew is kind to everyone, from the barista at our favorite coffee shop to the elderly man who walks his dog past our hiking trail every weekend. The career success I've achieved in Portland has been built on my own merits rather than desperate attempts to prove my worth. My current company promoted me to senior marketing manager last month, recognizing my strategic thinking and leadership abilities. I'm working on campaigns for clients whose missions align with my values, using my skills to promote sustainable businesses and social justice organizations. I've also started a side business designing logos and marketing materials for small nonprofits, work that allows me to use my creative abilities while supporting causes I care about. The financial independence I've achieved gives me options and security that I never had when I was trying to build a life with someone else or waiting for family approval to pursue my dreams. Looking back on the person I was 2 years ago, I feel enormous compassion for the woman who was so desperate for love and validation that she ignored obvious red flags and accepted treatment that was far below what she deserved. That version of myself was doing the best she could with the tools and understanding she had at the time, but she was operating from a place of fear and scarcity rather than strength and abundance. The diary that Jessica left behind my dresser was initially devastating because it shattered my illusions about the people I trusted most. But it ultimately became the catalyst for the most positive transformation of my life. It forced me to confront painful truths that I had been avoiding and to make difficult decisions that led to genuine healing and growth. I no longer define myself by other people's ability to see my worth or by my success in maintaining relationships that require me to compromise my well-being. I've learned that being alone is infinitely better than being with people who consistently choose to hurt you, and that the love worth having is the kind that's freely given rather than desperately earned. The rain is stopping now, and sunlight is beginning to break through the clouds over the Portland skyline. I have dinner plans with Andrew tonight at a new restaurant that sources all its ingredients from local farms, and tomorrow Sarah and I are driving to the coast to photograph the wildflowers that bloom along the clifftops in spring. My calendar is full of activities and people that bring me joy, purpose, and authentic connection. If I could go back and tell my younger self anything, it would be that her worth was never in question and that the right people would see and appreciate her value without needing constant proof. I would tell her that walking away from people who consistently choose to hurt you isn't giving up on love but rather making space for the genuine love that you deserve. And I would tell her that the most important relationship she'll ever have is the one she builds with herself, because that's the foundation that everything else meaningful will be built upon. The woman writing these words is confident, fulfilled, and surrounded by genuine love and support. She no longer accepts crumbs when she deserves feasts, no longer makes excuses for people who choose to hurt her, and no longer believes that her happiness depends on anyone else's approval or affection. The journey to get here was painful, but every step was necessary to become the person I was always meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.